The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway as Catherine Walsh stood at the kitchen window, watching her sister-in-law Margaret load suitcases into the family sedan. 3 years of living under the same roof, and it had come to this. Margaret's movements were sharp, deliberate, each piece of luggage thrown into the trunk like an accusation. The children, David's nephews, scrambled around the car, their laughter piercing the tension that had settled over the Henderson household like morning frost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, the ceramic, cold against her skin. She hadn't slept. Again. The conversation from the night before echoed in her mind, each word a fresh wound. Margaret's voice, usually so composed during family dinners, had cracked with frustration as she spoke to David in the hallway outside their bedroom door. "It's been 5 years, David. 5 years of hoping, of praying, of watching her face every month when nothing happens. And now she just sits there empty, taking up space that could belong to a real family." Catherine had pressed her back against the bedroom wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to cover her ears, to block out the words that confirmed every fear she'd carried since the day Dr. Morrison had delivered the news with clinical precision. Unexplained infertility, no clear cause, no guaranteed solution, just an endless string of failed attempts and mounting medical bills that had drained their savings and apparently their welcome in David's family home. "She's my wife," David had replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But even he sounded tired, worn down. The fight had gone out of him somewhere between the 3rd specialist and the 4th negative pregnancy test. "And I'm your sister," Margaret had shot back. "I'm thinking about what's best for everyone. Tom got that promotion in Denver. We could use the space here for the boys. They're growing, they need their own rooms. And honestly, David, this house feels like a funeral home with her around." The screen door creaked open behind Catherine, and she turned to see David's mother, Eleanor Henderson, shuffling into the kitchen. At 73, Eleanor still commanded respect in Millbrook social circles, her silver hair always perfectly set, her spine straight despite the arthritis that had begun to slow her steps. This morning, however, she looked older, tired, the weight of the decision they'd all made pressing down on her shoulders. "Margaret's leaving for Denver today," Eleanor said, her voice matter-of-fact. She moved to the coffee maker, her back to Catherine. "Tom's already there, getting the new house ready." Catherine nodded, though Eleanor couldn't see her. "I know." "The boys are excited. New schools, new friends. It'll be good for them." Another nod. Catherine understood the subtext. It would be good for them to get away from the house where hope had come to die, away from the woman who couldn't give them cousins, away from the constant reminder of what a marriage without children looked like. Eleanor turned, studying Catherine's face with the same clinical detachment she'd once used to examine bruised fruit at the farmer's market. "You know this can't continue." "I know. David won't say it. He's too loyal, too kind. But this is killing him, killing all of us." Eleanor's voice softened slightly, but the words cut just as deep. "You're a good woman, Catherine, but sometimes being good isn't enough." The weight of the statement settled between them like dust. Catherine had heard variations of it from Dr. Morrison, from the fertility counselor, from the well-meaning church. Ladies who whispered behind their hymn books about God's plan and mysterious ways. But hearing it from Eleanor, the woman who had welcomed her into the Henderson family with open arms 6 years ago, felt like the final nail in a coffin she'd been building for herself, one failed month at a time. Outside, Margaret's voice carried through the window as she called to her sons. "Boys, say goodbye to Aunt Catherine. We need to get on the road." The front door burst open, and 10-year-old Michael and 8-year-old James tumbled into the kitchen. their faces flushed with excitement about the adventure ahead. They wrapped their arms around Catherine's waist, their innocent affection, a sharp contrast to the coldness that had settled over the adult members of the family. "We're going to have a big house in Denver," Michael announced, his gap-toothed grin wide. "Mom says I can have my own room and put up my baseball posters. And I get the room with the window that looks at the mountains," James added, bouncing on his toes. "Mom says maybe we can go skiing." Catherine knelt down to their level, forcing a smile. "That sounds wonderful. You'll have to send me pictures." "Will you visit us?" Michael asked, his brown eyes serious. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Eleanor cleared her throat softly, and Margaret appeared in the doorway, car keys jingling in her hand. "Come on, boys, we have a long drive ahead of us." As the children hugged Catherine one last time and raced out to the car, Margaret lingered in the doorway. For a moment, her composed mask slipped, and Catherine caught a glimpse of genuine sadness in her sister-in-law's eyes. "I'm not the villain here, Catherine. I hope you understand that someday." Then she was gone, leaving Catherine alone with Eleanor and the weight of unspoken truths. Through the window, she watched the sedan pull away, the boys' faces pressed against the back glass, waving until the car disappeared around the bend in the road. The house felt cavernous without their laughter. Eleanor retreated to her sewing room, the soft whir of her machine filling the silence. Catherine remained at the kitchen window, staring at the empty driveway until David's pickup truck appeared, kicking up dust as he returned from his morning shift at the lumber mill. He climbed out slowly, his work boots heavy on the gravel. At 32, David Henderson still looked like the high school quarterback who had swept Catherine off her feet at a church social 7 years ago. But the easy smile that had first caught her attention was absent now, replaced by the weary expression of a man carrying burdens too heavy for his shoulders. He found her in the kitchen, still standing at the window. "They got off okay?" he asked, hanging his keys on the hook by the door. "About an hour ago." David nodded, moving to the refrigerator for a beer he wouldn't normally open before noon. The small rebellion felt significant. "Mom, talk to you?" "She..." "And did." He twisted off the cap, took a long pull from the bottle. "What did she say?" Catherine turned from the window to face him. "What do you think she said?" David's shoulders sagged. He set the beer on the counter and rubbed his face with both hands. "Catherine, I don't!" The word came out sharper than she intended. "Please don't, not today." But the conversation was inevitable, and they both knew it. It had been building for months, lurking beneath every failed treatment, every negative test, every well-meaning question from church members about when they might hear the patter of little feet. The pressure had grown unbearable, not just from the family, but from the town itself. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce the next generation. "I saw Dr. Morrison yesterday," David said quietly. "He called with the results from your last blood work." Catherine's stomach clenched. "And?" "Same as before. Nothing's changed." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Catherine, maybe it's time we talked about other options." "What options?" The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. "Adoption agencies want couples who can prove they're stable, David." "How do we explain that we're living with your mother because we spent our house fund on fertility treatments? How do we convince them we're suitable parents when your own family thinks I'm defective? Nobody thinks you're defective, don't they?" Catherine's voice rose, years of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. "Margaret couldn't wait to get her boys away from me. Your mother looks at me like I'm a cancer that's metastasized through the family. And you..." She stopped herself, the words too painful to voice. "And me what?" "You haven't touched me in 3 months, David." "Not really. Not like you used to." Every time you look at me, I see disappointment. Every conversation we have circles back to what's wrong with me, what we can do to fix me, how we can make me into something I'm apparently not. David stared at her, his face pale. That's not fair, isn't it? Tears burned Catherine's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. When was the last time you told me you loved me without it being followed by, "We'll figure this out," or "Everything happens for a reason," or some other platitude designed to make both of us feel better about the fact that I'm broken? The word hung between them like a physical presence. Broken. It was the word Catherine whispered to herself in the mirror each morning, the word that followed her through grocery stores where every other woman seemed to be pushing a stroller or cradling a baby. Broken, defective, less than David's beer bottle, sweated condensation onto the counter. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, and somewhere down the street children squealed with delight as they played in a sprinkler. The sounds of normal life, continuing around them as if their world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I do love you," David said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you so much it hurts, but you're right. I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to be your husband when everything I say makes things worse. I don't know how to comfort you when I need comforting too." The honesty was brutal and necessary. Catherine felt something inside her chest crack open, not with pain, but with a strange kind of relief. Finally, truth. Finally, someone willing to admit that they were all drowning. "Your mother wants me to leave," Catherine said softly. David's head snapped up. "She said that?" Not in so many words, but the message was clear. This house needs to heal, and I'm the infection preventing that from happening. This is our home too. Is it? Catherine looked around the kitchen with its outdated appliances and Eleanor's collection of ceramic roosters lining the windowsill. "We've been here 3 years, David. 3 years of being guests in your childhood home because we couldn't afford our own place after the medical bills. 3 years of walking on eggshells around your mother's grief about the grandchildren she'll never have. 3 years of watching Margaret's boys grow up while we remain frozen in place, waiting for a miracle that's not coming." The truth of it settled over them both. They had been treading water for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like to move forward. The fertility treatments had become their entire identity, consuming not just their finances, but their dreams, their conversations, their intimacy. They had become the couple that other couples whispered about, the cautionary tale that made newlyweds hold their babies a little tighter. Eleanor's sewing machine fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Catherine could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, marking time that felt increasingly precious and finite. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, her voice steadier now. "Maybe your mother's right. Maybe it is time for a change." David's face went white. "Catherine, no. We can try again. Dr. Morrison said there are new treatments, experimental procedures, with..." "What money, David? With what emotional reserves? I'm 30 years old and I feel ancient. I wake up every morning wondering if this will be the day I finally break completely, and I go to bed every night, knowing I've disappointed everyone who matters to me just by existing." The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. For years, she had swallowed her pain, had tried to be the grateful wife, the hopeful patient, the understanding daughter-in-law. She had smiled through baby showers and children's birthday parties, had nodded sympathetically when friends complained about sleepless nights and dirty diapers, had pretended that their pity didn't cut her deeper than any scalpel. "I used to dream about our children," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had names picked out, girl names, boy names. I knew which bedroom would be the nursery, how I'd decorate it. I used to imagine teaching our daughter to braid her hair, or watching you throw a baseball with our son in the backyard. But those dreams are poisoning me now, David. Every time I see a pregnant woman or hear a baby cry, I feel something ugly and bitter rising up inside me. That's not who I want to be. David reached for her again, and this time she didn't pull. Away! His hands were rough from years of manual labor, calloused and strong. She remembered when those hands had felt like promises, like protection. Now they felt like anchors, holding her down in a life that no longer fit. "What are you saying?" he asked. Catherine met his eyes, seeing her own pain reflected there. "I'm saying maybe it's time I stopped trying to be something I'm not. Maybe it's time I figured out who Catherine Walsh actually is, instead of who Catherine Henderson was supposed to become." The use of her maiden name wasn't accidental, and they both knew it. It was the first step in a process neither of them wanted to acknowledge, but both could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. David's hands tightened around hers. "Don't give up on us, please." "I'm not giving up on us," Catherine said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. "I'm trying to save what's left of us, of me, before there's nothing left to save." Outside, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the morning mist that clung to the hills surrounding Millbrook. The day was going to be hot, the kind of oppressive August heat that made everything feel thick and slow. Catherine could already feel sweat gathering at the base of her neck, could see the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt in the distance. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face carefully neutral. "I thought I'd make a light lunch. Sandwiches, maybe some of that potato salad from yesterday." The normalcy of the suggestion felt surreal. Here they were, Catherine's marriage possibly ending, her place in the family clearly revoked, and Eleanor was worried about lunch. But perhaps that was how families fell apart, not with dramatic confrontations, but with the steady accumulation of small betrayals, tiny cuts that bled until there was nothing left. "I'm not hungry," Catherine said, releasing David's hands. "I think I'll take a walk." She left them standing in the kitchen, Eleanor and her son, mother and child, reunited in their shared disappointment. The screen door slammed behind her with more force than she intended, the sound echoing across the yard. Like a gunshot, the street was quiet in the way that only small towns could be on a weekday morning. Most of the men were at work, the children still weeks away from returning to school. Catherine walked without direction, her feet carrying her past houses she'd known for years, past the lives of people who had once been friends but had gradually pulled away as her situation became increasingly uncomfortable to witness. At the corner of Maple and 3rd, she passed the Grayson house, where Janet Grayson was hanging laundry on the line, her 8-month-old daughter bouncing in a carrier on her chest. Janet waved, her smile bright and unconsciously cruel. 6 months ago, she had been one of Catherine's closest friends. Now their conversations were limited to weather and pleasantries, the comfortable intimacy they'd once shared, poisoned by Catherine's inability to share in the joy of new motherhood. Catherine waved back and kept walking, her pace quickening as she left the residential streets behind and headed toward the outskirts of town. Here the houses grew farther apart, separated by fields of corn and soybeans that stretched toward the horizon. The air was cleaner here, free from the weight of judgment and expectation that seemed to cling to every building in Millbrook's center. She found herself at the old covered bridge that spanned Miller's Creek, a wooden structure that had been built when the town was young and hopeful. The creek ran shallow in the summer heat, barely more than a trickle over sun-bleached stones. Catherine sat on the bridge's weathered planks, her legs dangling over the side, and for the first time in months allowed herself to simply exist. Without the burden of trying to be anyone else, the silence was profound. No sewing machines, no well-meaning advice, no medical terminology or treatment schedules. Just the lazy buzz of insects and the distant sound of wind moving through the corn. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to remember who she had been before. The wanting had consumed her before her body had become a battlefield where hope and despair fought daily skirmishes. She had been a teacher once, before fertility treatments became a full-time job. She had loved working with children, had been good at it. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She could nurture and guide other people's children, but couldn't produce any of her own. Another failure to add to the growing list. A truck rumbled past. On the road behind her, the sound fading as it continued toward town. Catherine didn't turn to look. She was tired of being seen, tired of the sympathetic glances and uncomfortable silences that followed her like shadows. For now, at this moment, she wanted to be invisible, but invisibility, she was beginning to understand, might be just another word for disappearing entirely. And perhaps, given everything that had happened, that wouldn't be such a terrible thing after all. The morning shift at Miller's grocery began before dawn, when the delivery trucks arrived with fresh produce and dairy products that needed to be shelved before the store opened at 7. Catherine had taken the job 3 months ago, desperate for something to fill the empty hours that stretched between David's departure for work and his return each evening. The employment had raised eyebrows throughout Millbrook. Henderson women didn't work retail, Eleanor had made that clear, but Catherine no longer cared about the opinions of people who had already written her off. She pushed her cart through the narrow aisles, methodically restocking shelves with boxes of cereal and canned goods. The work was mindless, repetitive, exactly what she needed. It required no emotional investment, no hope, no dreams of future fulfillment. She scanned barcodes, faced products, swept floors. The simplicity was liberating after years of charting temperatures, timing medications, and scheduling her life. Around ovulation windows and appointment calendars. At 8:15, Mrs. Patricia Hoffman wheeled her cart through the automatic doors, her grey hair perfectly curled despite the early hour. Patricia had been Catherine's 4th-grade teacher, back when Catherine's biggest worry was memorizing multiplication tables. Now she approached with the careful smile reserved for the tragically flawed, her eyes bright with the kind of pity that masqueraded as concern. The invitation was casual, offered without expectation, but Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. When had someone last invited her anywhere without ulterior motives? Without the hope that she might find healing or inspiration or whatever it was people thought she needed. "I might like that," she said. Robert nodded and disappeared into the morning sunlight, leaving Catherine alone with her inventory sheets and the unexpected warmth of human kindness offered without conditions. The rest of her shift passed quietly. She processed deliveries, updated stock records, and fielded the occasional question from customers who seemed surprised to find her working among the canned goods and cleaning supplies. By 2 o'clock, when her replacement arrived, Catherine was ready to escape the store's fluorescent lighting and controlled atmosphere. She drove home slowly, taking the long route that wound through Millbrook's older neighborhoods, where mature oak trees provided shade, and the houses sat back from the road behind well-tended gardens. These were the homes of families who had been in town for generations, whose roots ran deep into the community's social soil. Catherine had once imagined herself living in such a house someday, raising children who would attend the same schools. She had, contributing to the same traditions and institutions that had shaped her own childhood. Now those dreams felt like artifacts from someone else's life. She could no more picture herself as the matriarch of an established Millbrook family than she could imagine sprouting wings and flying away from her troubles. Both scenarios required a fundamental transformation that seemed beyond her reach. The Henderson house appeared around the final bend, its white clapboard siding bright against the afternoon sky. David's truck was already in the driveway, which meant he had come home early. Catherine felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Early returns usually meant bad news, An injury at the mill, a problem with his mother, or another conversation about their future that neither of them wanted to have. She found David and Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, a manila envelope spread open between them. Eleanor's face was flushed, whether from excitement or distress Catherine couldn't determine. David looked up when she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "How was work?" he asked. "Fine. What's going on?" Eleanor cleared her throat. "We received some news today about Margaret's house in Denver." Catherine set her purse on the counter, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Margaret had been gone for less than 24 hours. What crisis could have developed so quickly? "She called this afternoon," David continued. "The house they bought has some structural problems the inspection missed. Foundation issues. They're looking at major repairs, possibly having to move. Out temporarily while the work is done." Catherine sank into the remaining chair. "I'm sorry to hear that. It must be stressful for her." "She wants to come back," Eleanor said bluntly. "Just temporarily while they figure out what to do. The boys could finish the school year here, and it would give Tom time to deal with the contractors and insurance companies." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. Margaret wanted to return to the house. Catherine was already being pressured to leave. The boys would reclaim their temporary bedrooms, their voices would fill the hallways again, and Catherine would become even more obviously the extra person in a space too small for everyone's needs. "What did you tell her?" Catherine asked. "That we needed to talk to you first," David said, though his tone suggested the conversation was a formality. "She's family, Catherine. We can't turn our backs on her when she needs help." Of course they couldn't. Catherine understood the logic, even admired it. The Henderson family took care of their own, provided shelter and support during times of crisis. It was one of the qualities that had drawn her to David in the first place, this sense of belonging to something larger and more stable than herself. The irony was not lost on her that she apparently no longer qualified as a family worth protecting. "When would she want to come back?" Catherine asked. "Next week, possibly sooner. The foundation engineer wants to start work immediately before the problems get worse." Catherine nodded slowly, her mind racing through possibilities and logistics. Where would she go? What could she afford on her grocery store salary? The questions multiplied faster than she could process them, each one revealing another layer of her dependence and vulnerability. "I'll start looking for somewhere else to stay," she said finally. "Catherine, you don't have to—" David began, but she held up her hand. "Yes, I do. You both know I do." She looked at Eleanor, whose relief was poorly concealed. "Margaret has children who need stability. I understand that has to be the priority." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "You're a good woman, Catherine. I hope you know that this isn't personal, but of course it was personal. Everything about the past 5 years had been intensely, devastatingly personal. Catherine's inability to conceive had become the lens through which every relationship was examined, every decision filtered. She was the crack in the family foundation that kept spreading despite everyone's efforts to repair it. "I'll need a few days to find something," Catherine said. "A week at most." "Take whatever time you need," David said, though they all knew time was a luxury she didn't actually possess. That evening, Catherine sat on the front porch swing, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The August heat had finally begun to break, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of Eleanor's prized rose bushes. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed, and children's voices carried from the playground behind the elementary school. Normal sounds of normal life in a normal town where she had somehow become abnormal. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to imagine where she would be a week from now, but the future remained stubbornly blank. For 5 years, she had defined herself by what she was trying to become: a mother, a complete woman, a fulfilled wife. Now she would have to discover who she actually was beneath all those failed aspirations. The thought was terrifying and, unexpectedly, liberating. For the first time in years, she would be answerable only to herself. The prospect of such freedom was almost too overwhelming to contemplate, but as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine found herself looking forward to finding out what Catherine Walsh might accomplish when she stopped trying to be someone else. 7 years earlier, Catherine Walsh had been the kind of woman other women envied without malice. At 23, fresh from completing her education degree at State University, she possessed the rare combination of beauty and intelligence that made her equally popular at faculty meetings and church socials. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like spun copper, and her laugh had a musical quality that could make even the most reserved individuals want to join whatever conversation had inspired such joy. She had returned to Millbrook with ambitious plans. The elementary school had offered her a third-grade position, and she intended to revolutionize how reading was taught to struggling students. Her apartment above Henderson's pharmacy was small but charming, with windows that overlooked Main Street and enough space for the classroom supplies she was constantly accumulating. Catherine Walsh was going to make a difference, and everyone who knew her believed she would succeed. The night she met David Henderson, she had been helping her landlord's wife, Mrs. Henderson, prepare food for the annual church fundraiser. Eleanor had recruited Catherine the moment she moved to town, recognizing both her willingness to volunteer and her skill in the kitchen. They were arranging dessert tables when David arrived to help his mother transport the heavy serving dishes to the fellowship hall. Catherine had noticed him immediately. At 25, David possessed the confident bearing of someone comfortable with physical labor, his hands strong from years of construction work, his smile genuine rather than practiced. When he offered to carry the 3-tier cake she had spent hours decorating, she found herself studying the careful way he lifted it, how he asked twice to ensure he understood her instructions about keeping it level. "You must be the new teacher," he had said as they walked across the church parking lot. "Mom's been talking about you for weeks. All good things, I hope. Mostly about how you reorganized her spice cabinet and introduced her to some cooking techniques she'd never heard of. She's been experimenting ever since. Dad's been very patient about the results." Catherine had laughed, delighted by his dry humor and the obvious affection in his voice when he spoke about his parents. Family loyalty was important to her, and David Henderson clearly understood the concept. Their courtship had unfolded with the leisurely pace of people who believed. They had unlimited time to get everything right. They attended church together, went to movies at the renovated theater downtown, took long drives through the countryside, while Catherine pointed out landmarks, and David shared stories about growing up in Millbrook. He was steady where she was, energetic, practical where she was idealistic, and their differences felt complementary rather than conflicting. The proposal came on a warm evening in May, during the spring festival that transformed Main Street into a corridor of craft booths and food vendors. David had suggested they walk to the covered bridge, where teenagers traditionally went to escape. Parental supervision, and Catherine had teased him about trying to recapture his youth. When he knelt beside Miller's Creek with his grandmother's engagement ring, she had been so surprised that her first response was laughter, the delighted, disbelieving kind that signaled pure happiness. "Catherine Walsh," he had said, his voice steady despite the nervous tremor in his hands. "Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" She had said yes before he finished the question, and the ring had fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting decades for her finger. Later, they learned that Eleanor had secretly measured Catherine's jewelry while she slept during a weekend visit, but that night the perfect fit had seemed like divine confirmation that they were meant to build a life together. Their wedding. The following autumn, had been everything Catherine had dreamed of since childhood. The ceremony took place at First Baptist, with flowers from Eleanor's garden decorating the altar, and Catherine's childhood friend Sarah serving as maid of honor. David's best man was his cousin Michael, a jovial man who delivered a toast that made everyone laugh and cry simultaneously. Catherine wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and felt beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, the same space where they had met. Catherine's parents had driven down from Chicago, and David's extended family filled 3 long tables with Henderson relatives who welcomed her with the warmth she had always associated with small-town life. When she and David shared their first dance to At Last, Catherine had looked out at the faces surrounding them and felt rich with belonging. Their honeymoon was a modest affair, 4 days at a cabin near Lake Michigan, but Catherine had been enchanted by the simplicity of it. They hiked forest trails, cooked meals over a fire pit, and talked about their plans for the future with the confidence of people who believed they controlled their destiny. David wanted to eventually take over his father's construction business, and Catherine intended to pursue a master's degree in education, while establishing herself as Millbrook's most innovative teacher. They would buy a house with a large yard, maybe the old Victorian on Elm Street that had been for sale since before Catherine graduated college. And children, of course. They both wanted children, 3 or 4, spaced 2 years apart, so they could be playmates, but not overwhelming for Catherine to manage while maintaining her career. They had discussed names during long evening walks, debated the merits of various parenting philosophies, and agreed that their children would grow up with the same sense of security and community support that had shaped both their own childhoods. The first year of marriage had been a revelation in happiness. They rented a small house 3 blocks from the elementary school, close enough for Catherine to walk to work even in winter. David's construction projects kept him busy but not overly stressed, and his income combined with Catherine's teaching salary allowed them to save for the down payment on their dream house while still enjoying occasional luxuries like dinner at the new Italian restaurant or tickets to the traveling theater productions that occasionally came through the county. Catherine threw herself into teaching with passionate dedication, staying late to create bulletin boards that told stories rather than simply displaying student work, developing reading programs tailored to individual learning styles, and organizing field trips that brought learning to life. Her classroom became known as the place where struggling students found confidence and gifted children encountered appropriate challenges. Parents requested her specifically, and the principal began mentioning her name when discussing the school's future leadership. At home, she and David settled into comfortable routines that felt both exciting and secure. They cooked together on weeknight evenings, with David handling proteins while Catherine managed vegetables and starches. Weekends were spent visiting family, working in their small garden, or exploring antique shops in neighboring towns where they collected pieces for the home they would someday own. They attended church faithfully, joined a young couple's Bible study, and began to be seen as one of those partnerships that made marriage look easy and desirable. It was during their 2nd year of marriage that they decided to start trying for their first child. The decision was made without drama or extensive discussion. They had always planned to begin their family around this time, and both felt ready for the adventure of parenthood. Catherine discontinued birth control with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted her body's ability to perform its most fundamental function. For the first 6 months, they approached conception with the same systematic optimism. They brought to other projects. Catherine tracked her cycles, read books about nutrition during pregnancy, and began taking prenatal vitamins just to be ready. David researched cribs and car seats with the thoroughness he applied to construction. Materials, creating spreadsheets that compared safety ratings and customer reviews. They cleaned out the spare bedroom and began casually referring to it as the nursery, though they hadn't yet purchased any actual baby furniture. When Catherine didn't conceive immediately, neither was particularly concerned. The books all emphasized that it could take up to a year for healthy couples to achieve pregnancy, and both she and David were young, active, and had no reason to suspect fertility problems. They joked about being overachievers who expected instant results, and Catherine's doctor assured her that stress about conception could actually delay the process. By the end of their second year of trying, however, the casual confidence had begun to erode. Catherine found herself becoming obsessive about timing, purchasing ovulation predictor kits and basal thermometers that turned their intimate life into a carefully choreographed medical procedure. David remained patient and supportive, but she could see the confusion in his eyes when romantic evenings were suddenly interrupted by thermometer readings, or when she announced that they needed to postpone a weekend trip because it conflicted with her fertile window. The third year brought their first visit to a fertility specialist. Dr. Morrison was kind but clinical, ordering tests for both Catherine and David that revealed no obvious problems. Her hormone levels were normal, her reproductive anatomy appeared healthy, and David's sperm count exceeded recommended parameters. Unexplained infertility, Dr. Morrison had said, as if the label provided comfort rather than increased frustration. More common than you might think. We'll start with some basic interventions and see how you respond. The basic interventions became increasingly complex and expensive. Medication to stimulate ovulation led to intrauterine insemination procedures, which evolved into discussions about in vitro fertilization when the simpler treatments failed to produce results. Each failed cycle brought crushing disappointment, followed by renewed determination to try again, to try something different, to refuse to give up on the dream that had defined their marriage from its beginning. Catherine's teaching began to suffer, as medical appointments consumed more of her time and emotional energy. She took personal days for procedures, sick days for recovery, and found herself unable to concentrate during parent conferences where other women discussed their children's progress with the casual assumption that motherhood was a shared experience. Her students sensed her distraction, and her principal began making diplomatic inquiries about whether she might benefit from counseling or reduced responsibilities. David's construction business, meanwhile, was thriving. His reputation for quality, work and fair pricing had led to more contracts than he could handle, and he was considering hiring additional workers to meet demand. The irony was bitter. Their professional lives were succeeding beyond their original expectations, while their personal dreams crumbled under the weight of medical bills and monthly disappointments. By their fourth year of marriage, the fertility treatments had consumed their savings and begun to strain their relationship in ways neither had anticipated. Their sex life had become completely medicalized, their conversations dominated by treatment protocols and appointment schedules. Catherine found herself resenting David's apparently effortless ability to remain hopeful while she fought daily battles against despair and self-blame. The breaking point came during their fifth year of trying, when Catherine suffered her second miscarriage at 8 weeks. The pregnancy had been achieved through their third IVF cycle, and the loss felt like a cruel joke played by a universe that had given them hope only to snatch it away. Catherine had spent 2 months believing she was finally pregnant, had begun telling family members and close friends, had started shopping for maternity clothes with the giddy excitement of someone whose dreams were finally coming true. The bleeding started on a Thursday morning as she was preparing for school, By Friday evening, she was home from the hospital with instructions to rest and follow up with Dr. Morrison in 2 weeks. David had taken the day off to care for her, bringing tea and attempting conversation while Catherine stared at the ceiling and wondered how many more losses she could endure before something inside her broke permanently. "We can try again," David had said, his voice gentle but strained. "Dr. Morrison said this doesn't mean anything about future pregnancies." Catherine had turned to look at him, this man she loved, who somehow still believed that persistence and optimism could overcome any obstacle. "I can't," she had whispered. "I can't keep doing this to us." But of course she could, and she did. 3 more IVF cycles over the next 18 months, each one funded by loans against David's business and Catherine's retirement account. Each failure carved away another piece of her confidence, her joy, her ability to imagine a future that didn't revolve around reproductive calendars and medical procedures. The final attempt had been their most promising. 2 embryos transferred. Hormone levels that suggested implantation, symptoms that convinced Catherine she was finally, definitively pregnant. When the pregnancy test came back negative, she had sat in Dr. Morrison's office and felt something essential inside her simply switch off. "I think we need to take a break," she had told David that evening. "Maybe think about other options." But other options required money they no longer had, and emotional resources that had been depleted by years of hope and disappointment. Adoption agencies wanted financial stability and psychological evaluations that would certainly reveal the toll the fertility struggles had taken on their marriage. Foster care required training and home studies, and the ability to open their hearts to children who might be removed without warning. Instead, they had moved in with Eleanor to save money and figure things out, though neither could articulate what exactly they were trying to figure out or how long the process might take. The temporary arrangement had stretched into 3 years, during which Catherine had watched David's sister raise her sons in the space that should have been occupied by their own children, had endured family gatherings where her childlessness was a constant reminder of everything they had failed to achieve. Now, at 30, Catherine felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with calendar years. She had become an expert in reproductive endocrinology, could recite statistics about conception rates and treatment success, knew more about her own body's failures than seemed possible for someone so young. But she had forgotten how to laugh without thinking about what she was missing, how to see pregnant women without feeling stabbed by envy, how to imagine a future that might hold happiness despite the absence of the children who had once seemed essential to any meaningful life. The woman who had returned to Millbrook with ambitious plans to change the world through innovative teaching had been replaced by someone who could barely manage a part-time job at the grocery store without feeling exhausted by the effort required to interact normally with people who had no idea how much courage it took her to get out of bed each morning. She realized, as she sat in her car outside Miller's grocery the morning after learning about Margaret's return, grieving not just the children she would never have, but the woman she had been before wanting them had consumed every other aspect of her identity, that Catherine Walsh had been confident, optimistic, full of plans and dreams that extended far beyond reproductive success. This Catherine Walsh could barely remember what those other dreams had been, let alone imagine pursuing them. But perhaps, she thought as she watched Robert Chen unload vegetables from his truck with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, it was time to find out whether anything of her former self had survived the ordeal of the past 5 years. Perhaps it was time to discover who Catherine Walsh might become if she stopped trying to be someone else entirely. The possibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And for the first time in years, Catherine found herself curious about her own future rather than simply dreading it. The apartment above Chen's Hardware was nothing like the cozy space Catherine had imagined when she first called about the rental listing. The narrow staircase leading to the second floor creaked ominously under her weight, and the single room that served as both living area and bedroom smelled of motor oil and old wood. A tiny kitchenette occupied one corner, its appliances dating from the 1970s, while a bathroom barely large enough for one person completed the modest accommodations. But it was hers for $300 a month, utilities included, and the elderly Mr. Chen, who owned the building, had asked no questions. Beyond her ability to pay the first month's rent in advance, Catherine stood in the center of the empty space, her few possessions stacked in cardboard boxes beside the door, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the peculiar freedom that comes with having absolutely nothing left to lose. The hardware store below had been closed for 6 months, ever since Mr. Chen's arthritis had made it impossible for him to manage the daily operations. Dust covered the merchandise on the shelves, and the cash register sat open and empty, its drawer gaping like a mechanical mouth frozen in surprise. Through the large front windows, Catherine could see the main street of Millbrook continuing, its daily routines oblivious to her small drama of displacement and new beginnings. She had moved out of the Henderson house 3 days earlier, while David was at work, and Eleanor was attending her weekly bridge club meeting. The cowardice of the timing wasn't lost on her, but Catherine had exhausted her capacity for difficult conversations and tearful goodbyes. Instead, she had left a note on the kitchen table expressing gratitude for their hospitality and a forwarding address for any mail that might arrive in her name. David had called that evening, his voice tight with emotions she couldn't identify. "You didn't have to sneak out like you were ashamed of something." "I wasn't ashamed," Catherine had replied, though even she wasn't convinced by the assertion. "I just thought it would be easier for everyone." "Easier for who? For you? For me? Because I can tell you right now, coming home to find your note instead of my wife wasn't easier for anybody." The conversation had deteriorated from there, touching on accusations and resentments they had both tried to keep buried. David wanted to know where she was living, whether she was safe, when they might talk about working things out. Catherine had provided minimal information and promised to call again soon, though she had no clear sense of what they might have left to discuss. Margaret and the boys had arrived 2 days later, their car loaded with suitcases and toys, and the sort of cheerful chaos that comes with children who consider every change of address an adventure. Catherine had watched their arrival from her new window, feeling like a ghost, observing the life she might have had if her body had cooperated with her dreams. The work at Miller's grocery had become her anchor, the only part of her routine that remained constant. She arrived early, performed her duties with mechanical efficiency, and left promptly at the end of her shift. Tom Miller had been kind about her change of address, adjusting her schedule to accommodate the longer walk from her apartment to the store. He seemed to understand that she was someone who needed the structure that employment provided, regardless of the modest wages involved. It was during her second week in the apartment that Robert Chen began appearing at unexpected moments throughout her day, not intrusively, and never in ways that suggested he was monitoring her activities, but with the sort of quiet presence that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone in the world. She would emerge from the grocery store to find him loading supplies into his truck across the street, or discover him examining produce at the farmer's market while she purchased her modest weekly groceries. Their interactions remained minimal, but somehow significant. A nod of acknowledgement when their paths crossed, a brief comment about the weather or the quality of the tomatoes he was delivering. Once, when she was struggling to carry a bag of cat litter up the narrow stairs to her apartment, he had simply appeared and taken the bag from her hands without being asked. Disappearing again before she could formulate adequate thanks, Catherine had acquired the cat, a grey tabby she named Oliver, from the animal shelter on a particularly lonely Saturday afternoon. She had no experience with pets. Eleanor had been allergic to animal dander, and their previous rental properties had prohibited four-legged tenants. But Oliver's calm demeanor and missing left eye had appealed to her sense of kinship with damaged creatures, trying to make the best of imperfect circumstances. The cat had adapted to their small living space with impressive grace, spending his days positioned in the window that overlooked the street below. Catherine found his presence comforting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Oliver demanded nothing beyond food and occasional attention, offered affection without conditions, and seemed perfectly content with their modest accommodations. It was Oliver who first alerted her to Robert's more deliberate acts of kindness. On a particularly hot Thursday in September, Catherine returned from work to find a window air conditioning unit sitting beside her apartment door, still in its original packaging. No note, no explanation, but she recognized Robert's truck parked across the street and understood the gift's source. She carried the unit inside and spent 2 hours following the installation instructions, her frustration mounting as she struggled with brackets and electrical connections that seemed designed for someone with more mechanical aptitude. When she finally admitted defeat and sat on her bed near tears, she heard footsteps on the stairs outside. Robert knocked twice, softly, and waited for her permission before entering. He surveyed the scattered parts and partially assembled unit, without comment, then knelt beside the window and began working with the focused attention of someone who understood both machinery and the importance of not making others feel incompetent. "You were close," he said as he secured the final bracket. "The hardest part is knowing which screws belong where." Catherine watched him work, noting the economy of his movements and the careful way he handled each component. "You didn't have to do this. Buy the unit, I mean. It's too expensive." "It's used," Robert replied, though the packaging had clearly indicated otherwise. "My neighbor was upgrading and asked if I knew anyone who might need it." The lie was transparent and generous, offered in a way that allowed Catherine to accept the gift without feeling like a charity case. She stored the fabrication away as evidence that kindness could be delivered with dignity intact. "Still," she said. "Thank you." Robert nodded and gathered his tools. "Oliver seems to approve." The cat had indeed positioned himself directly in front of the air conditioning unit's cooling vents, his purr audible from across the room. Catherine found herself almost smiling for the first time in weeks. "He's not particularly demanding," she said. "Unlike most males I've known." The comment was meant as light-hearted self-deprecation, but Robert's expression grew serious. "Demanding isn't always a character flaw. Sometimes it just means someone knows their worth." The observation was delivered quietly, without emphasis, but Catherine felt it settle into her consciousness like a seed finding fertile ground. When had she last made demands of anyone? When had she last acted as if she possessed worth that merited consideration? After Robert left, Catherine lay on her bed, listening to the air conditioning unit's gentle hum and contemplating the implications of his statement. For years, she had tried to minimize her needs, to become small and unobtrusive so that others might find her more acceptable. She had apologized for her infertility, for her sadness, for her inability to bring joy and laughter to family gatherings. She had accepted blame for circumstances beyond her control and absorbed criticism without defending herself. But what if she stopped apologizing? What if she began acting as if her feelings and needs mattered as much as everyone else's? The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Catherine had grown accustomed to thinking of herself as fundamentally flawed, someone whose defects required constant management and apology. The idea that she might simply be a woman who deserved kindness and respect seemed almost revolutionary. Over the following weeks, she began to notice other small gestures that suggested Robert was paying attention to her welfare. Fresh vegetables occasionally appeared outside her apartment door, always varieties she had admired during his deliveries to the grocery store. When her ancient car began making alarming noises, she found a business card for a reliable mechanic tucked under her windshield wiper, along with a note that mentioned Robert had spoken to the owner about fair pricing for emergency repairs. Most significantly, Robert had begun timing his visits to Miller's grocery to coincide with Catherine's breaks. He would arrive just as she stepped outside for fresh air, offering casual conversation that required no emotional investment, but provided human connection she hadn't realized she was craving. He spoke about his vegetables, about weather patterns that affected growing seasons, about the satisfaction of nurturing something from seed to harvest. His voice held a calm certainty that Catherine found deeply soothing. Growing things requires patience, he had said during one of these conversations as they sat on the loading dock behind the store, sharing coffee from the vending machine. And faith. You plant something, tend it properly, and trust that the right conditions will eventually produce results. Catherine had understood he wasn't only talking about agriculture. What if the right conditions never come? Then you learn to appreciate what does grow. Sometimes the harvest is different from what you expected, but no less valuable. She had studied his profile as he spoke, noting the lines around his eyes that suggested both sorrow and hard-won wisdom. Is that what you're doing here? Learning to appreciate a different harvest. Robert had been quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her chest ache with sympathy. My wife, Lynn, couldn't have children either. We tried for 8 years, spent everything we had on treatments and specialists. She blamed herself, thought. She was failing me somehow. He paused, watching a delivery truck navigate the narrow alley behind the store. I loved her exactly as she was, but I couldn't convince her of that. The wanting consumed her until there wasn't room for anything else. Catherine felt tears burning her eyes. What happened to her? She took pills, too many of them on purpose, left me a letter saying she was setting me free to find someone who could give me the family I deserved. The words hung between them like a physical presence. Catherine could barely breathe around the grief that filled her chest. Grief for Lynn, for Robert, for herself and all the women who had been convinced their worth depended on their reproductive capacity. I'm sorry, she whispered. I came here to get away from the memories, the house we shared, the places where we'd been happy before everything became about what we couldn't have. Robert turned to look at her directly. But I've learned something. About grief. It changes shape, but it doesn't disappear. You have to decide whether it's going to make you smaller or teach you to understand other people's pain. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Which did you choose? I'm still choosing every day. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you carry yourself with dignity despite everything people have put you through, it reminds me that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. The conversation had marked a turning point. In their relationship, Robert's presence in her life became more deliberate, less coincidental. He began stopping by her apartment in the evenings, sometimes bringing soup he claimed to have made in excessive quantities, other times simply sitting with Oliver while Catherine graded the papers she had started taking home from her substitute. Teaching assignments. Tom Miller had helped her find the substitute work, calling contacts at the school district to recommend Catherine for positions covering maternity leaves and sick days. The irony of temporarily replacing teachers who were having babies wasn't lost on her, but the work provided both additional income and a reminder of skills she had once possessed. Being in classrooms again, helping children with math problems, and reading assignments, gradually restored some of her confidence in her own competence. Robert never pushed for deeper intimacy or more frequent contact than Catherine felt ready to handle. Instead, he offered steady presence and quiet understanding, the kind of companionship that asked nothing but provided the security of knowing someone cared, whether she was safe and reasonably content. He fixed the leaky faucet in her bathroom, brought her books from the library when she mentioned missing access to good literature, and listened without judgment when she talked about the difficulty of rebuilding a life she had never intended to live. But it was the way he looked at her that began to heal something fundamental in Catherine's perception of herself. Robert's eyes held no pity, no disappointment, no expectation that she should be someone other than who she was. When he spoke to her, his attention was complete and respectful, as if her thoughts and opinions mattered independent of any role she might play in his life or anyone else's. For the first time since her marriage began deteriorating, Catherine started to believe she might be someone worth knowing, worth protecting, worth loving exactly as she was. The realization was fragile and new, requiring careful tending like the seedlings Robert nurtured in his greenhouse. But it was growing, slowly and steadily, into something that felt remarkably like hope. And as autumn settled over Millbrook with its crisp mornings and brilliant foliage, Catherine began to understand that sometimes the most profound rescues happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated weight of small kindnesses offered by someone who sees your worth when you've forgotten it yourself. The annual Harvest Festival had been a cornerstone of Millbrook's social calendar for over a century, transforming the town square into a bustling marketplace where local farmers displayed their finest produce, crafters sold handmade goods, and families gathered to celebrate another successful growing season. Catherine had attended every festival since childhood, first with her parents, then as a young teacher chaperoning student groups, and later as David's wife, helping Eleanor manage the Henderson family's traditional apple cider booth. This year, she hadn't planned to attend at all. The festival represented everything she was trying to avoid: crowds of families with children, conversations about domestic accomplishments she couldn't claim, the inevitable questions about her marriage and her conspicuous absence from community events. Catherine had scheduled herself to work an extra shift at Miller's grocery, reasoning that someone needed to handle the increased demand for last-minute festival supplies. But Tom Miller had other ideas. "Catherine, you've been working every weekend for 2 months," he said, as she arranged her supplies in the break room Friday morning. "Take Saturday off, go to the festival, eat some funnel cake. Remember what it feels like to be part of something bigger than inventory management." "I'm fine." "Working," Catherine protested. The extra hours help you avoid dealing with people who might ask uncomfortable questions," Tom interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand the impulse, believe me. After my divorce, I hid in this store for nearly a year, but eventually you have to rejoin the world or you'll forget how to live in it." Tom's divorce had happened 15 years earlier, but Catherine had never heard him reference it directly. She studied his weathered face, recognizing the expression of someone who had survived his own period of social exile and emerged with hard-earned wisdom about the necessity of human connection. "What if I'm not ready?" she asked. "Nobody's ever ready for the hard stuff," Tom replied. "But ready or not, life keeps happening around you. Better to participate on your own terms than to let other people decide what your story means." Catherine spent Friday evening debating whether to follow Tom's advice. The festival would officially begin Saturday morning with a parade down Main Street, followed by the opening of vendor booths and the start of various competitions: pie contests, pumpkin carving, apple bobbing for the children. By afternoon, the high school marching band would perform, and local politicians would deliver speeches about community values and agricultural heritage. She had attended every aspect of these festivities for 7 years as David's wife, had helped judge the pie contest 3 times, had volunteered to supervise children's activities when teachers were needed. But that version of Catherine Henderson belonged to a life that no longer existed. Catherine Walsh, the woman who lived alone above a closed hardware store and worked retail to pay rent, had no clear place in Millbrook's celebration of family and tradition. Saturday morning arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, brilliant sunshine, and the kind of clarity that made distant hills appear close enough to touch. Catherine could hear the marching band practicing in the school. Parking lot, the sound of drums and brass instruments drifting through her open window. Oliver positioned himself on the windowsill, tail twitching as he watched the increased activity on the street below. At 10 o'clock, Catherine found herself standing in front of her small closet, contemplating clothes she hadn't worn in months. The festival required casual attire, but she wanted to look intentional rather than accidentally underdressed. She settled on dark jeans and a rust-colored sweater that complemented her auburn hair, adding the silver earrings David had given her for their 2nd anniversary before remembering their significance and replacing them with plain studs. Walk to the town square took 15 minutes, time Catherine used to rehearse responses to questions she might encounter. "How are you doing?" "Fine, thank you. Are you still living with Eleanor?" "No, I have my own place now." "How's David?" "He's well, as far as I know." The answers felt stilted and defensive, but they would serve to deflect curiosity without inviting deeper conversation. The festival was already in full swing when Catherine arrived, with families streaming between booths that offered everything from homemade jam to hand-carved wooden toys. The Henderson family apple cider stand occupied its traditional location near the gazebo, with Eleanor presiding over a large copper kettle, while Margaret managed sales, and Michael and James handed out samples to anyone willing to brave their sticky fingers. Catherine deliberately avoided that section of the square, instead gravitating toward the produce displays where Robert had arranged an impressive selection of late-season vegetables. His booth was busier than she had expected, with customers examining butternut squash and sampling the small potatoes he had harvested just days earlier. Robert himself stood behind the display table, answering questions about growing techniques and storage methods with the patient expertise of someone who genuinely enjoyed sharing knowledge. He noticed Catherine approaching and offered a small smile that conveyed both pleasure at seeing her and understanding of the courage it had required for her to attend. "Good morning," he said as she reached the booth. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Tom Miller insisted I needed to rejoin civilization," Catherine replied, picking up a perfect apple from Robert's display. "He may have been right. The apples are particularly good this year," Robert said. The late summer heat followed by cool nights created ideal sugar concentration. Catherine appreciated his focus on neutral topics that required no personal revelation. "I'll take a bag, and some of those small potatoes. They look perfect for roasting." As Robert filled a paper bag with her selections, Catherine became aware of conversations happening at nearby booths. 2 women she recognized from church were discussing someone's recent pregnancy announcement while examining handmade quilts. A group of fathers compared notes about their children's upcoming soccer season while their wives browsed jewelry displays. The festival buzzed with the easy camaraderie of people who shared common experiences and mutual concerns. Catherine felt simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, present in the crowd, but separate from its central purpose of celebrating family and community continuity. She was about to excuse herself and retreat to her apartment when a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise. "Well, look who decided to show her face in public." Catherine turned to see Jessica Palmer approaching, her expression carrying the particular brand of malicious curiosity that some people reserved for observing others' misfortunes. Jessica had been 2 years ahead of Catherine in school and had harbored a grudge ever since Catherine had been chosen for the lead in their high school's spring musical. Now married to the bank president and mother of 4 children, Jessica possessed the social confidence of someone who had achieved all the conventional markers of success. "Hello, Jessica," Catherine said, keeping her voice neutral. "I heard you moved out of the Henderson house," Jessica continued, clearly relishing the opportunity to gather fresh gossip. "Such a shame about your marriage, though I suppose it was inevitable, given the circumstances." Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not sure what circumstances you're referring to." "Oh, come now," Jessica said, her voice pitched to carry to nearby listeners. "Everyone knows why David's family wanted you out. A man needs sons to carry on his name, and if a wife can't provide them—" She shrugged as if the conclusion was self-evident. "Jessica." Robert's voice carried a warning that made several people turn in their direction. He had moved from behind his booth to stand beside Catherine, his presence both protective and somehow dangerous. "Oh, hello, Robert," Jessica said, her tone shifting to forced sweetness. "I didn't see you there. How are you settling into our little community?" "Well enough to recognize gossip when I hear it," Robert replied, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, "and to know the difference between appropriate conversation and public cruelty." Jessica's face flushed. "I was simply expressing concern for an old friend." "No," Robert said, stepping closer to Jessica until she was forced to look up at him. "You were entertaining yourself at the expense of someone who has shown more grace under pressure than you could imagine, and you were doing it because you thought no one would call you on it." The conversation at surrounding booths had gradually ceased as people became aware of the tension developing near Robert's produce display. Catherine could see Eleanor Henderson approaching from the direction of the cider stand, her face tight with concern. Margaret followed at a distance, clearly reluctant to become involved, but unwilling to miss the drama. "Robert, please," Catherine said quietly. "It's not worth it." But Robert had reached some internal limit that prevented him from backing down. "Actually, it is worth it, because someone needs to tell the truth about what happened to you, and everyone in this town is too comfortable with their version of events to care about accuracy." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but Robert continued, before she could speak. "You want to know about the circumstances, Jessica? Here are the circumstances. Catherine spent 5 years trying to have children with a man she loved. She underwent medical procedures that were painful, expensive, and invasive. She suffered miscarriages that devastated her emotionally while bankrupting her financially. Through all of this, she continued teaching your children and volunteering for community events and pretending to be grateful for your prayers and advice. More people had gathered now, drawn by the unusual spectacle of Robert Chen, quiet, private Robert, who had lived among them for months without revealing any personal opinions, delivering what sounded like a prepared speech in defense of Catherine Walsh. When the treatments failed and the money ran out, did her husband fight for her? Did his family rally around her? Did this community that claims to value marriage and commitment offer support? Robert's voice grew stronger with each question. No, they made her feel like a failure. They pushed her out of her home. They whispered about divine punishment and personal inadequacy until she started believing she deserved their rejection. Catherine could see David now, pushing through the crowd with an expression she couldn't interpret. Behind him, Eleanor looked stricken, as if she was witnessing something she had tried to prevent. Margaret had disappeared entirely, presumably, unwilling to be associated with whatever scandal was developing. "And you," Robert said, focusing again on Jessica, "you think you have the right to judge her choices because you've been fortunate enough to conceive easily? You think your fertility makes you morally superior to someone who wanted children desperately but couldn't have them?" "That's enough," David said, arriving at the edge of the gathering crowd. "Robert, I appreciate your concern, but this is between Catherine and our family." Robert turned to face David, and Catherine saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. This was not the gentle farmer who had quietly befriended her over the past months. This was a man who had survived his own devastating loss and recognized the particular cruelty of blaming victims for circumstances beyond their control. "Is it?" Robert asked. "Because from where I stand, your family stopped including Catherine the moment she couldn't provide what they wanted from her, and this community stopped treating her like a human being the moment she became inconvenient to their comfortable assumptions about women's purposes." Eleanor finally reached them, her face pale but determined. "Mr. Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Robert interrupted. "Just consequences. For months, you've all treated Catherine like she was contagious, like her infertility might somehow spread to your own daughters if you showed her too much kindness. You've let her work a retail job to survive while living in a cramped apartment above a closed store, and you've convinced yourselves that this is somehow natural justice." Catherine wanted to disappear, to somehow extract herself from the scene that was developing around her without her permission, but she also felt something stirring inside her chest that she barely recognized. A kind of fierce gratitude that someone was finally saying aloud the truths she had carried in silence for so long. "Catherine is not broken," Robert continued, his voice carrying clearly across the increasingly quiet festival. "She is not defective. She is not being punished by God for some imaginary sin. She is a woman who wanted children and couldn't have them. And instead of receiving compassion, she's been treated like a cautionary tale." David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You don't know anything about our marriage or our family situation." "I know what I've observed," Robert replied steadily. "I know that Catherine is one of the kindest, most resilient people I've ever met. I know that she's spent years apologizing for things that weren't her fault, while everyone around her acted like her pain was somehow optional. And I know that she deserves better than being made to feel ashamed for circumstances that would have destroyed weaker people entirely." The crowd had grown to include most of the festival attendees, creating an impromptu amphitheater around the confrontation. Catherine could see familiar faces throughout the gathering. Former colleagues, church members, neighbors who had known her since childhood. Some looked uncomfortable with the public nature of the discussion, while others seemed riveted by the drama unfolding before them. "Catherine," Eleanor said, addressing her directly for the first time, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." But Catherine found herself shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she had expected. "I'm tired of private discussions where I'm asked to understand everyone else's perspective while my own feelings are treated as unreasonable." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, many of which belonged to people who had once been friends, colleagues, fellow community members. "Robert is right. I've spent years trying to be the grateful victim, the understanding wife, the woman who accepts rejection with dignity. But I'm done pretending that any of this has been acceptable." The words felt dangerous and liberating, like stepping off a cliff she had been standing on for far too long. Catherine could see shock and discomfort in many faces, but also recognition in others, women who perhaps understood the particular pain of feeling judged for their reproductive choices, people who had witnessed the gradual erosion of her place in the community without speaking up to defend her. "I didn't choose to be infertile," Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't choose to undergo painful treatments that failed. I didn't choose to lose my savings, my home, or my marriage to medical procedures that promised hope but delivered only heartbreak. But I did choose to survive it all with as much dignity as I could manage, and I refuse to apologize for that anymore." The silence that followed her words was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of children playing in the park across the street. Catherine could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could see the mixture of emotions playing across the faces of people who had known her for years but had perhaps never really seen her. It was David who finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "Catherine, I never wanted you to feel like you had to apologize for anything." Catherine met his eyes across the small distance that separated them, seeing her former husband clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "Maybe you didn't want it," she said gently, "but you allowed it. We all allowed it. And now we have to decide whether we're going to continue allowing it or whether we're going to remember what community actually means." The confrontation that had begun with Jessica Palmer's casual cruelty had evolved into something larger and more significant, a moment when hidden truths were finally spoken aloud and a community was forced to examine its own complicity in the suffering of one of its members. And as Catherine stood in the center of it all, flanked by Robert's steady presence and facing the judgment of people who had shaped her understanding of belonging, she realized that she was no longer the broken woman who had been cast out by her family. She was someone who had found her voice again, and she was finally ready to use it. The Monday morning following the Harvest Festival confrontation, Catherine arrived at Miller's grocery, expecting to find curious stares and uncomfortable silences. Instead, she discovered Mrs. Evelyn Price waiting beside the employee entrance, clutching a covered casserole dish and wearing an expression of determined resolve. At 78, Evelyn Price commanded respect throughout Millbrook as the unofficial keeper of social protocols and community memory. She had taught Sunday school for 43 years, organized countless church fundraisers, and possessed the particular authority that comes from having witnessed 7 decades of small-town drama, without succumbing to gossip or malicious speculation. "Catherine, dear," Mrs. Price said, as Catherine fumbled with her keys, "I brought you some of my tuna noodle casserole. I remember you always asked for the recipe at church suppers." Catherine accepted the dish with confusion and gratitude. Mrs. Price had spoken to her exactly twice since her separation from David, both conversations limited to polite pleasantries that carefully avoided any reference to personal circumstances. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Price, but you didn't need to—" "Oh, but I did," Mrs. Price interrupted, her voice carrying the firmness of someone who had made an important decision. "What that Chen fellow said on Saturday about how this town has treated you, well, it made me examine my own conscience pretty thoroughly, and I didn't much like what I found there." Catherine glanced around the empty parking lot, aware that their conversation was taking place in full view of anyone who might be passing by. "Mrs. Price, you don't owe me any explanations, don't I?" The older woman's eyes held a sadness that spoke of genuine regret. "I've been attending First Baptist for 62 years, child. I've heard more sermons about loving your neighbor and caring for the suffering than I could count. But when one of our own was hurting, what did I do? I crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations. I told myself I was respecting your privacy when I was really protecting my own comfort." The admission hung between them like morning mist, delicate and significant. Catherine had grown so accustomed to being treated as a cautionary tale that Mrs. Price's acknowledged. "The thing is," Mrs. Price continued, "I lost 2 babies myself back in the 50s. Miscarriages, they called them then, though we didn't talk about such things the way people do now. For years, I felt like a failure as a woman, like God was punishing me for some sin I couldn't identify. If the ladies at church had treated me the way we've treated you, I might not have survived it." Catherine felt tears gathering in her eyes. Mrs. Price had never mentioned lost pregnancies, had never hinted at understanding the particular grief that comes with reproductive failure. Her revelation transformed their relationship from polite acquaintance to something approaching kinship. "I had 3 children after the losses," Mrs. Price said, "but I never forgot how it felt to believe I was broken beyond repair. When I saw you struggling, I should have reached out. I should have shared my story so you'd know you weren't alone. Instead, I stayed silent and let you carry that burden by yourself." "You couldn't have known," Catherine said softly. "But I could have asked. I could have shown interest in your well-being instead of avoiding you like you had something contagious." Mrs. Price adjusted the casserole dish in Catherine's arms. "That young man of yours was right about one thing. This community has forgotten what it means to care for people when they're inconvenient." Catherine wanted to correct the assumption about Robert being her young man, but something in Mrs. Price's expression suggested the distinction wasn't important to her. What mattered was the recognition that Catherine deserved support regardless of her romantic circumstances. "Anyway," Mrs. Price said, straightening her shoulders, "I wanted you to know that some of us are ashamed of how we've behaved, and we're going to do better." The conversation with Mrs. Price proved to be the first of many unexpected encounters over the following weeks. Catherine discovered that the public confrontation at the festival had created fractures in Millbrook's social consensus, forcing residents to examine their own actions and attitudes in ways that made many people uncomfortable. Not everyone appreciated this forced self-reflection. Jessica Palmer had complained to anyone who would listen about Robert's inappropriate outburst and Catherine's public display of self-pity. A few church members suggested that airing personal grievances at a community event showed poor judgment and questionable character, but these voices were increasingly outnumbered by people who had been disturbed by Robert's accurate description of Catherine's treatment. Women who had struggled with their own fertility issues began sharing stories they had kept private for years. Parents who remembered Catherine's dedication as a teacher expressed regret about withdrawing their friendship when she needed it most. Even some of the Henderson family's longtime supporters admitted that Eleanor's handling of the situation had been unnecessarily harsh. The shift in community attitude manifested in small but significant ways. Catherine's substitute teaching assignments increased as principals remembered her reputation for excellence in the classroom. The apartment complex manager stopped by to mention that a larger unit would be available soon if she was interested in upgrading her living situation. Local business owners began greeting her by name when she shopped, engaging in the kind of casual conversation that signaled acceptance rather than mere tolerance. Most surprisingly, Catherine received a phone call from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the high school principal, requesting a meeting about a permanent teaching position that would become available in January. The conversation took place on a crisp October afternoon in Dr. Mitchell's office, with sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the football field where Catherine had once cheered for David during his senior year. "I'll be honest with you, Catherine," Dr. Mitchell said, reviewing Catherine's file. "When you left the elementary school, there were questions about your reliability. The medical absences, the difficulty concentrating during parent conferences. Some people wondered if you were still committed to teaching." Catherine felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "I understand their concerns. But," Dr. Mitchell continued, "I've spoken with every substitute coordinator in the district, and the feedback about your recent work has been overwhelmingly positive. You're showing up prepared, engaged, and effective. Whatever personal challenges you were dealing with seemed to be resolving." The assessment was accurate. Catherine had discovered that returning to classroom teaching, even temporarily, had restored her sense of professional competence. Working with teenagers required different skills than elementary instruction, but she found their curiosity and energy invigorating rather than exhausting. The position would be teaching 9th and 10th grade. English, Dr. Mitchell explained. Not your original specialty, but your transcript shows strong literature coursework, and your writing samples suggest you could handle the curriculum effectively. Catherine accepted the offer immediately, recognizing it as more than employment. It was validation that her skills and dedication were valued by people who understood education. The permanent position would provide health insurance, retirement benefits, and a salary that would allow her to rent a proper apartment while building savings for her future. The news of Catherine's professional advancement spread quickly through Millbrook's interconnected social networks. Some residents expressed genuine pleasure at her success, while others seemed surprised that a woman they had written off could demonstrate such resilience. The range of reactions provided Catherine with valuable insight into which relationships were worth rebuilding and which ones she should approach with caution. Robert's response to her career news was characteristically thoughtful and supportive. He arrived at her apartment that evening carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Dr. Mitchell called me for a reference," he admitted, as Catherine invited him inside. "I hope you don't mind. She wanted to know about your character, your reliability, your ability to handle pressure." Catherine was touched by his advocacy, but curious about the connection. "How do you even know Dr. Mitchell?" "The school district buys vegetables for their lunch program. I've been supplying them since August." Robert opened the wine with practiced efficiency. "When she mentioned they were considering you for the English position, I felt obligated to share some observations about your qualifications." "What kind of observations?" Robert handed her a glass of wine and settled into the chair that had become his usual spot during their evening conversations. "I told her about the literacy program you developed for your grocery store co-workers, how you've been helping Jenny Chen with her college application essays, the way you talk about books and teaching with more passion than most people bring to anything in their lives." Catherine stared at him with amazement. She had helped Jenny, Tom Miller's part-time employee, with her writing assignments, but she hadn't realized Robert was aware of these activities. The literacy program had been an informal effort to help several co-workers improve their reading skills, something she had pursued because she missed working with people who were eager to learn. "You've been watching me pretty carefully," she said. "I've been learning from you," Robert corrected. "Watching someone rebuild their life with grace and determination. It's been instructive for someone still figuring out how to move forward after loss." The admission carried weight that went beyond professional recommendations or friendly support. Catherine recognized that their relationship had evolved into something more complex than companionship between two damaged people seeking comfort in shared understanding. Robert's presence in her life had become essential to her sense of stability, and his quiet advocacy had played a crucial role in her community rehabilitation. But perhaps more importantly, Catherine had begun to see herself through Robert's eyes, not as a woman defined by her reproductive failures, but as someone whose strengths and accomplishments existed independent of her ability to bear children. His perspective had gradually replaced the harsh self-judgment she had carried for years, allowing her to recognize her own worth without requiring external validation. The autumn progressed with steady improvement in Catherine's circumstances and social standing. The teaching position provided structure and purpose that had been missing from her life since leaving her elementary school job. Her students responded well to her enthusiasm for literature, and she found satisfaction in helping them develop critical thinking skills that would serve them throughout their education. Her relationship with the Henderson family remained complicated, but had shifted toward mutual respect, if not warmth. David had called several times, ostensibly to discuss practical matters like tax paperwork and insurance beneficiaries, but clearly hoping for deeper conversation about their future. Catherine had kept these discussions brief and cordial, unwilling to provide false hope but not wanting to cause unnecessary pain. Eleanor had surprised her by attending one of Catherine's evening literacy classes at the community centre, bringing several friends who were struggling with reading comprehension due to vision changes and limited formal education. The older woman's presence represented a form of public support that carried significant social weight in Millbrook's hierarchical community structure. "I should have done this months ago," Eleanor admitted after the class ended. "Supporting your work, I mean. You have gifts that this town needs, regardless of whatever else has happened." The apology was incomplete and carefully worded, but Catherine accepted it as genuine acknowledgement of past mistakes. Eleanor would never become a close confidant, but their relationship had stabilized into something approaching mutual recognition of each other's worth. Margaret and her children had settled back into their routines at the Henderson house, with the boys adjusting to their temporary return to Millbrook schools. Catherine occasionally encountered them at the grocery store or around town, and their interactions were friendly, if somewhat stilted. The children seemed confused by the family dynamics they had witnessed, but were too young to understand the complex emotions underlying adult relationships. Most significantly, Catherine had begun to envision a future that extended beyond mere survival. The teaching position would allow her to rent a house with a proper kitchen and enough space for the books she had stored in boxes for years. She was considering adopting a second cat to keep Oliver company, and had even contemplated taking art classes at the community college where she might rediscover creative interests that had been dormant since her marriage began deteriorating. These plans represented more than practical improvements to her circumstances. They signified her belief that she deserved happiness and fulfillment, independent of romantic relationships or reproductive success. For the first time since her diagnosis of unexplained infertility, Catherine was making decisions based on her own desires rather than other people's expectations or medical recommendations. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. Instead, it had occurred through the accumulation of small victories and gradual shifts in perspective that allowed her to remember who she had been before grief and disappointment had overshadowed her other qualities. Robert's friendship had been instrumental in this process, but ultimately the change had come from within, from her decision to stop apologizing for circumstances beyond her control and start advocating for the life she actually wanted rather than the one she had been told she should want. As November arrived with its shorter days and preparation for winter, Catherine felt ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. She had learned to distinguish between people who supported her growth and those who preferred her in a diminished state. She had rediscovered professional skills that brought satisfaction and community recognition. Most importantly, she had begun to understand that healing from profound loss didn't require forgetting the pain, but rather learning to carry it without allowing it to define every aspect of her existence. The woman who had been cast out by her family for failing to provide children had become someone who contributed to her community in ways that had nothing to do with reproduction. And while the future remained uncertain, Catherine finally believed she had the strength and wisdom to navigate whatever came next with dignity intact and hope restored. Spring arrived in Millbrook with unusual gentleness, bringing warm rains that coaxed daffodils from frozen ground and filled the air with the promise of new beginnings. Catherine stood in the kitchen of her newly rented cottage on Birch Street, watching Robert work in the garden behind her house. His movements were deliberate and patient as he prepared the soil for the vegetable plot they had planned together. During the long winter evenings, the cottage itself was everything Catherine had dreamed of during her months in the cramped apartment above Chen's Hardware. 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with windows overlooking the backyard, and enough space for the furniture she had retrieved from storage and the books that had finally found their way out of boxes. Oliver had claimed the sunny window seat in the living room, while his new companion, a calico kitten named Luna, had established herself as the household's official supervisor of all human activities. 6 months into her permanent teaching position, Catherine had discovered a professional confidence she hadn't possessed even during her earlier career. Her students responded to her combination of academic rigor and genuine care, and their parents frequently requested conferences to discuss their children's remarkable improvement in reading comprehension and analytical thinking. The literacy, a program she had expanded at the community center, now served over 30 adults, many of whom had gone on to pursue GED certificates or community college courses. But perhaps the most significant change in Catherine's life was the evolution of her relationship with Robert. What had begun as friendship born from shared understanding of loss had slowly transformed into something deeper and more sustaining. They had never formally discussed the progression of their feelings, but their connection had deepened through countless small moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, the comfortable silence that comes when two people feel completely understood by another person. Robert's proposal had come on a February evening as they walked along Miller's Creek, the same covered bridge where Catherine had once sat in despair, providing the backdrop for his careful words about building a life together based on partnership rather than conventional expectations. "I'm not asking you to heal my grief or replace what I lost," he had said, his breath visible in the cold air, "and I'm not promising to fix whatever pain you still carry. But I think we've learned something about love that doesn't depend on other people's definitions of what makes a family complete." Catherine had accepted without hesitation, recognizing in Robert's proposal an offer of genuine partnership rather than rescue or redemption. Their engagement had been met with widespread approval throughout Millbrook, though Catherine suspected some residents were simply relieved that her story was ending in a socially acceptable manner. The wedding itself took place on a Saturday morning in early May, a small ceremony in the gardens behind Robert's farmhouse with only their closest friends and selected family members in attendance. Catherine wore a simple blue dress rather than traditional white, and Robert had asked Tom Miller to serve as his best man, while Mrs. Price stood as Catherine's witness. The vows they exchanged focused on mutual support, shared dreams, and the commitment to face whatever challenges might arise with honesty and courage. David had attended with Eleanor, both of them maintaining careful dignity throughout the proceedings. Catherine's conversation with her former husband the previous week had been one of the most difficult and necessary discussions of her adult life. "I want you to be happy," David had said, as they sat in the coffee shop downtown, the neutral territory where they had agreed to meet. "But I need to understand what went wrong between us. Not for the marriage, I know that's over, but for my own future relationships." Catherine had chosen her words carefully, recognizing that David's question came from genuine confusion rather than a desire to assign blame. "We stopped seeing each other as complete people and started focusing only on what we couldn't provide for each other. You became the man who couldn't make me pregnant, and I became the wife who couldn't give you children. Everything else about who we were got lost in that identity. Do you think we could have found our way back if we'd tried harder?" The question had haunted Catherine for months, and she answered with the honesty their shared history deserved. "Maybe, but it would have required both of us to let go of the life we thought we were supposed to have and figure out what life we actually wanted. Robert and I started from that place, knowing we couldn't have everything we once dreamed of, but discovering what remained possible." David had nodded slowly, seeming to understand that Catherine's new relationship represented healing rather than betrayal. "He's a good man, and you deserve someone who sees you the way he does." The wedding reception was held in the Fellowship Hall at First Baptist, the same space where Catherine and David had celebrated their marriage 7 years earlier. But this gathering felt entirely different, smaller, more intimate, focused on genuine celebration rather than elaborate display. Mrs. Price had organized the food preparation with her characteristic efficiency, while several of Catherine's former students helped serve and clean up throughout the afternoon. The most moving moment came when Jenny Chen, the young woman Catherine had helped with her college applications, stood to offer a toast. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Chen now, taught me that intelligence and kindness aren't things you use up by sharing them. When I was struggling with my essays and thought I wasn't smart enough for college, she spent hours helping me find my voice as a writer. She never made me feel stupid for not understanding something, and she celebrated every small improvement like it was a major victory. Jenny paused, clearly emotional. I know some people think teachers are just doing their jobs when they help students, but Catherine did more than teach me grammar and essay structure. She showed me that someone could believe in my potential even when I didn't believe in it myself. That's the kind of person she is, someone who sees possibility where other people see problems. The toast received enthusiastic applause from the assembled guests, many of whom had their own stories about Catherine's impact on their lives or the lives of their children. As Catherine looked around the room at faces that had once avoided her presence, she felt overwhelmed by the transformation that had occurred, not just in her circumstances, but in the community's understanding of her worth. After the reception ended and the last dishes were washed, Catherine and Robert returned to their farmhouse as the sun set over the fields that would soon be green with spring crops. They sat on the front porch swing that Robert had installed the previous month, watching fireflies begin their evening dance while Oliver and Luna explored their new territory. "No regrets?" Robert asked, his arm around Catherine's shoulders. "About which part?" Catherine replied, though she knew what he meant. Any of it. The marriage, the move, taking on a ready-made farm and a husband who talks to his vegetables. Catherine laughed, remembering the first time she had witnessed Robert's habit of providing encouraging commentary to his crops during morning inspections. "Definitely no regrets, though I reserve the right to be amused by your agricultural counseling sessions. The plants appreciate feedback. It's scientifically proven." "Is it really?" "Probably not. But it makes me feel useful during the growth process." They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Catherine reflected on the woman she had been a year earlier, isolated, despairing, convinced that her inability to bear children had disqualified her from happiness or meaningful contribution to her community. That woman felt like someone she had known long ago, someone she could remember with compassion but no longer resembled. "I've been thinking about Lynn lately," Robert said quietly, wondering what she would think about all this. Catherine had learned to speak freely about Robert's first wife, understanding that Lynn remained part of his story without threatening their present relationship. "What do you think she would say?" "That I was lucky to find someone who understood. That love doesn't require perfection." Robert paused, watching a barn owl circle overhead. "She would have liked you. You both had that quality of making other people feel valuable just by paying attention to them." "I would have liked her too," Catherine said, meaning it. Lynn's struggle with infertility had taken a different path than Catherine's, but their shared experience of feeling diminished by reproductive failure created a bond across time and circumstance. Summer progressed. Catherine and Robert settled into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease. Their different backgrounds and experiences had prepared them to appreciate partnership without demanding constant togetherness. Robert continued his farming, while Catherine threw herself into developing new curricula for her English classes and expanding the community literacy program. They shared evening meals and weekend projects, but maintained individual interests that kept their relationship dynamic rather than dependent. The question of children arose occasionally, usually prompted by well-meaning friends or family members, who seemed to believe that Catherine's new marriage might somehow resolve her fertility issues. Both she and Robert had learned to address these inquiries with gentle but firm clarity about their intentions to remain childless by choice rather than circumstance. We found ways to nurture growth that don't require biological reproduction. Catherine explained to Eleanor during one particularly direct conversation. Robert's relationship with his crops, my work with students and adult learners, these are forms of caregiving that bring us satisfaction and contribute to our community. Eleanor had surprised Catherine by nodding thoughtfully rather than offering counter-arguments about the importance of continuing family lines. I suppose I've been thinking about legacy all wrong, the older woman admitted. I was so focused on genetic inheritance that I forgot about all the other ways people can influence the future. The conversation represented a milestone in Catherine's relationship with her former mother-in-law, suggesting that even the most entrenched attitudes could evolve when people were willing to examine their assumptions honestly. As autumn arrived, once again, bringing the anniversary of Catherine's public confrontation at the Harvest Festival, she found herself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in her life and community. The festival itself had become an annual opportunity for residents to demonstrate their growth in understanding and acceptance, rather than a source of anxiety about social judgment. This year, Catherine and Robert operated a joint booth featuring his organic vegetables and her handmade preserves, a combination that proved popular with customers who appreciated both the quality of their products and the story of resilience their partnership represented. Several former students stopped by throughout the day, sharing updates about their academic progress and expressing gratitude for Catherine's influence on their educational development. The most significant moment came when Jessica Palmer approached their booth with obvious discomfort but apparent determination to make amends for her previous behavior. "Catherine, I owe you an apology," Jessica said, her voice tight with nervousness. "What I said last year was cruel and unfair. I've spent months thinking about why I felt the need to hurt someone who was already struggling, and I don't like the answers I've found." Catherine studied Jessica's face, recognizing genuine remorse rather than social obligation. "I appreciate you saying that. I think I was scared," Jessica continued. "Scared that what happened to you could happen to anyone, that fertility and marriage and family happiness aren't as secure as we like to believe. It was easier to find fault with you than to admit that we're all more vulnerable than we pretend." The admission revealed an understanding of human psychology that Catherine hadn't expected from Jessica, suggesting that the previous year's events had prompted soul-searching throughout the community. "We're all just trying to figure out how to be happy with the lives we actually have instead of the ones we thought we wanted." "Yes," Jessica said, relief evident in her expression. "Exactly that." As the festival wound down and Catherine and Robert packed up their booth, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in her own life, but in Millbrook's collective understanding of what constituted a meaningful existence. The public confrontation that had once seemed like her lowest moment had ultimately created space for deeper conversations about judgment, compassion, and the various ways people could contribute value to their communities. That evening, as she and Robert sat on their porch, watching another sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Catherine felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. She had learned that healing from profound loss didn't require forgetting the pain or pretending it hadn't mattered, but rather integrating that experience into a larger understanding of resilience and possibility. "I've been thinking about starting a support group," she told Robert, as Luna settled into her lap and Oliver claimed his spot between them. For women dealing with infertility, but also for anyone who feels like they're failing to meet society's expectations about what makes a valuable life. That's a beautiful idea, Robert said. You have a gift for helping people see their own worth when they've lost sight of it. Catherine smiled, recognizing the truth in his observation. The skills she had developed through her own struggle, the ability to maintain hope while accepting disappointment, to find purpose beyond conventional definitions of success, to extend compassion to others facing similar challenges, had become some of her greatest strengths. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine understood that her story had indeed found its resolution, but not in the way she had once imagined. She had not been rescued from her circumstances or magically granted the life she had originally wanted. Instead, she had learned to build something beautiful from the materials at hand, to create meaning from experiences that had once seemed purely destructive. The barren woman who had been cast out by her family had discovered that her worth was never dependent on her reproductive capacity. She had found love that was based on partnership rather than performance, community acceptance that recognized her contributions rather than her failures, and most importantly, self-respect that no longer required external validation. And in learning to value herself exactly as she was, Catherine had given others permission to do the same, creating ripples of acceptance and understanding that would continue long after her own story had moved beyond the need for dramatic resolution into the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with authenticity and grace. Spring arrived in Millbrook with unusual gentleness, bringing warm rains that coaxed daffodils from frozen ground and filled the air with the promise of new beginnings. Catherine stood in the kitchen of her newly rented cottage on Birch Street, watching Robert work in the garden behind her house. His movements were deliberate and patient as he prepared the soil for the vegetable plot they had planned together during the long winter evenings. The cottage itself was everything Catherine had dreamed of during her months in the cramped apartment. Above Chen's Hardware, 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with windows overlooking the backyard, and enough space for the furniture she had retrieved from storage and the books that had finally found their way out of boxes. Oliver had claimed the sunny window seat in the living room, while his new companion, a calico kitten named Luna, had established herself as the household's official supervisor of all human activities. 6 months into her permanent teaching position, Catherine had discovered a professional confidence she hadn't possessed even during her earlier career. Her students responded to her combination of academic rigor and genuine care, and their parents frequently requested conferences to discuss their children's remarkable improvement in reading comprehension and analytical thinking. The literacy program she had expanded at the community center now served over 30 adults, many of whom had gone on to pursue GED certificates or community college courses. But perhaps the most significant change in Catherine's life was the evolution of her relationship with Robert. What had begun as friendship born from shared understanding of loss had slowly transformed into something deeper and more sustaining. They had never formally discussed the progression of their feelings, but their connection had deepened through countless small moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, the comfortable silence that comes when 2 people feel completely understood by another person. Robert's proposal had come on a February evening as they walked along Miller's Creek, the same covered bridge where Catherine had once sat in despair, providing the backdrop for his careful words about building a life together based on partnership rather than conventional expectations. "I'm not asking you to heal my grief or replace what I lost," he had said, his breath visible in the cold air, "and I'm not promising to fix whatever pain you still carry. But I think we've learned something about love that doesn't depend on other people's definitions of what makes a family complete." Catherine had accepted without hesitation, recognizing in Robert's proposal an offer of genuine partnership rather than rescue or redemption. Their engagement had been met with widespread approval throughout Millbrook, though Catherine suspected some residents were simply relieved that her story was ending in a socially acceptable manner. The wedding itself took place on a Saturday morning in early May, a small ceremony in the gardens behind Robert's farmhouse with only their closest friends and selected family members in attendance. Catherine wore a simple blue dress rather than traditional white, and Robert had asked Tom Miller to serve as his best man while Mrs. Price stood as Catherine's witness. The vows they exchanged focused on mutual support, shared dreams, and the commitment to face whatever challenges might arise with honesty and courage. David had attended with Eleanor, both of them maintaining careful dignity throughout the proceedings. Catherine's conversation with her former husband the previous week had been one of the most difficult and necessary discussions of her adult life. "I want you to be happy," David had said as they sat in the coffee shop downtown, the neutral territory where they had agreed to meet. "But I need to understand what went wrong between us. Not for the marriage, I know that's over, but for my own future relationships." Catherine had chosen her words carefully, recognizing that David's question came from genuine confusion rather than a desire to assign blame. "We stopped seeing each other as complete people and started focusing only on what we couldn't provide for each other. You became the man who couldn't make me pregnant, and I became the wife who couldn't give you children. Everything else about who we were got lost in that identity. Do you think we could have found our way back if we'd tried harder?" The question had haunted Catherine for months, and she answered with the honesty their shared history deserved. "Maybe, but it would have required both of us to let go of the life we thought we were supposed to have and figure out what life we actually wanted." Robert and I started from that place, knowing we couldn't have everything we once dreamed of, but discovering what remained possible. David had nodded slowly, seeming to understand that Catherine's new relationship represented healing rather than betrayal. "He's a good man, and you deserve someone who sees you the way he does." The wedding reception was held in the Fellowship Hall at First Baptist, the same space where Catherine and David had celebrated their marriage 7 years earlier. But this gathering felt entirely different, smaller, more intimate, focused on genuine celebration rather than elaborate display. Mrs. Price had organized the food preparation with her characteristic efficiency, while several of Catherine's former students helped serve and clean up throughout the afternoon. The most moving moment came when Jenny Chen, the young woman Catherine had helped with her college applications, stood to offer a toast. Mrs. Chen now taught me that intelligence and kindness aren't things you use up by sharing them. When I was struggling with my essays and thought I wasn't smart enough for college, she spent hours helping me find my voice as a writer. She never made me feel stupid for not understanding something, and she celebrated every small improvement like it was a major victory." Jenny paused, clearly emotional. "I know some people think teachers are just doing their jobs when they help students, but Catherine did more than teach me grammar and essay structure. She showed me that someone could believe in my potential even when I didn't believe in it myself. That's the kind of person she is, someone who sees possibility where other people see problems." The toast received enthusiastic applause from the assembled guests, many of whom had their own stories about Catherine's impact on their lives or the lives of their children. As Catherine looked around the room at faces that had once avoided her presence, she felt overwhelmed by the transformation that had occurred, not just in her circumstances but in the community's understanding of her worth. After the reception ended and the last dishes were washed, Catherine and Robert returned to their farmhouse as the sun set over the fields that would soon be green with spring crops. They sat on the front porch swing that Robert had installed the previous month, watching fireflies begin their evening dance while Oliver and Luna explored their new territory. No regrets? Robert asked, his arm around Catherine's shoulders. About which part? Catherine replied, though she knew what he meant. Any of it. The marriage, the move, taking on a ready-made farm, and a husband who talks to his vegetables. Catherine laughed, remembering the first time she had witnessed Robert's habit of providing encouraging commentary to his crops during morning inspections. Definitely no regrets, though I reserve the right to be amused by your agricultural counseling sessions. The plants appreciate feedback. It's scientifically proven. Is it really? Probably not, but it makes me feel useful during the growth process. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Catherine reflected on the woman she had been a year earlier, isolated, despairing, convinced that her inability to bear children had disqualified her from happiness or meaningful contribution to her community. That woman felt like someone she had known long ago, someone she could remember with compassion but no longer resembled. "I've been thinking about Lynn lately," Robert said quietly, wondering what she would think about all this. Catherine had learned to speak freely about Robert's first wife, understanding that Lynn remained part of his story without threatening their present relationship. "What do you think she would say?" "That I was lucky to find someone who understood. That love doesn't require perfection." Robert paused, watching a barn owl circle overhead. "She would have liked you. You both had that quality of making other people feel valuable just by paying attention to them." "I would have liked her too," Catherine said, meaning it. Lynn's struggle with infertility had taken a different path than Catherine's, but their shared experience of feeling diminished by reproductive failure created a bond across time and circumstance. As summer progressed, Catherine and Robert settled into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease. Their different backgrounds and experiences had prepared them to appreciate partnership without demanding constant togetherness. Robert continued his farming, while Catherine threw herself into developing new curricula for her English classes and expanding the community literacy program. They shared evening meals and weekend projects, but maintained individual interests that kept their relationship dynamic rather than dependent. The question of children arose occasionally, usually prompted by well-meaning friends or family members who seemed to believe that Catherine's new marriage might somehow resolve her fertility issues. Both she and Robert had learned to address these inquiries with gentle but firm clarity about their intentions to remain childless by choice rather than circumstance. "We've found ways to nurture growth that don't require biological reproduction," Catherine explained to Eleanor during one particularly direct conversation. "Robert's relationship with his crops, my work with students and adult learners, these are forms of caregiving that bring us satisfaction and contribute to our community." Eleanor had surprised Catherine by nodding thoughtfully rather than offering counter-arguments about the importance of continuing family lines. "I suppose I've been thinking about legacy all wrong," the older woman admitted. "I was so focused on genetic inheritance that I forgot about all the other ways people can influence the future." The conversation represented a milestone in Catherine's relationship with her former mother-in-law, suggesting that even the most entrenched attitudes could evolve when people were willing to examine their assumptions honestly. As autumn arrived, once again, bringing the anniversary of Catherine's public confrontation at the Harvest Festival, she found herself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in her life and community. The festival itself had become an annual opportunity for residents to demonstrate their growth in understanding and acceptance, rather than a source of anxiety about social judgment. This year, Catherine and Robert operated a joint booth featuring his organic vegetables and her handmade preserves, a combination that proved popular with customers who appreciated both the quality of their products and the story of resilience their partnership represented. Several former students stopped by throughout the day, sharing updates about their academic progress and expressing gratitude for Catherine's influence on their educational development. The most significant moment came when Jessica Palmer approached their booth with obvious discomfort but apparent determination to make amends for her previous behavior. "Catherine, I owe you an apology," Jessica said, her voice tight with nervousness. "What I said last year was cruel and unfair. I've spent months thinking about why I felt the need to hurt someone who was already struggling, and I don't like the answers I've found." Catherine studied Jessica's face, recognizing genuine remorse rather than social obligation. "I appreciate you saying that. I think I was scared," Jessica continued. "Scared that what happened to you could happen to anyone, that fertility and marriage and family happiness aren't as secure as we like to believe. It was easier to find fault with you than to admit that we're all more vulnerable than we pretend." The admission revealed an understanding of human psychology that Catherine hadn't expected from Jessica, suggesting that the previous year's events had prompted soul-searching throughout the community. "We're all just trying to figure out how to be happy with the lives we actually have instead of the ones we thought we wanted." "Yes," Jessica said, relief evident in her expression. "Exactly that." As the festival wound down and Catherine and Robert packed up their booth, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in her own life, but in Millbrook's collective understanding of what constituted a meaningful existence. The public confrontation that had once seemed like her lowest moment had ultimately created space for deeper conversations about judgment, compassion, and the various ways people could contribute value to their communities. That evening, as she and Robert sat on their porch watching another sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Catherine felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. She had learned that healing from profound loss didn't require forgetting the pain or pretending it hadn't mattered, but rather integrating that experience into a larger understanding of resilience and possibility. "I've been thinking about starting a support group," she told Robert, as Luna settled into her lap and Oliver claimed his spot between them. "For women dealing with infertility, but also for anyone who feels like they're failing to meet society's expectations about what makes a valuable life." "That's a beautiful idea," Robert said. "You have a gift for helping people see their own worth when they've lost sight of it." Catherine smiled, recognizing the truth in his observation. The skills she had developed through her own struggle, the ability to maintain hope while accepting disappointment, to find purpose beyond conventional definitions of success, to extend compassion to others facing similar challenges, had become some of her greatest strengths. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine understood that her story had indeed found its resolution, but not in the way she had once imagined. She had not been rescued from her circumstances or magically granted the life she had originally wanted. Instead, she had learned to build something beautiful from the materials at hand, to create meaning from experiences that had once seemed purely destructive. The barren woman who had been cast out by her family had discovered that her worth was never dependent on her reproductive capacity. She had found love that was based on partnership rather than performance, community acceptance that recognized her contributions rather than her failures, and most importantly, self-respect that no longer required external validation. And in learning to value herself exactly as she was, Catherine had given others permission to do the same, creating ripples of acceptance and understanding that would continue long after her own story had moved beyond the need for dramatic resolution into the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with authenticity and grace. 2 years later, as Catherine stood before the mirror in her bedroom on a crisp December morning, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the haunted expression that had defined her features during the darkest period of her life. In its place was a face that radiated quiet confidence and hard-earned wisdom. Her auburn hair, now shorter and styled with deliberate care, framed features that had learned to smile without reservation. The support group she had envisioned that autumn evening had become a reality, meeting twice monthly in the community center where women from Millbrook and surrounding towns gathered to share their struggles with infertility, divorce, job loss, and the countless other ways life could deviate from expected paths. What had started as 8 nervous participants had grown into a network of over 40 women who had learned to support each other through crisis and celebration alike. Catherine's role as facilitator had evolved naturally from her own healing journey. She possessed the rare combination of personal experience and professional training that allowed her to guide difficult conversations while maintaining hope and perspective. The group had become known throughout the region, with counselors and physicians regularly referring clients who needed the specific kind of understanding that could only come from others who had walked similar paths. The beautiful thing about our group, Catherine had written in an article for the regional newspaper, is that we've learned to see strength in vulnerability and wisdom in uncertainty. Women who once felt isolated by their circumstances have discovered that sharing our struggles multiplies our resilience rather than our pain. The article had generated responses from across the state, leading to speaking engagements at conferences and workshops where Catherine shared her insights about building community support for people facing non-traditional life challenges. Her message resonated particularly strongly with healthcare providers who were seeking better ways to support patients dealing with reproductive issues and family planning struggles. On this particular December morning, Catherine was preparing for perhaps her most significant speaking engagement yet, a keynote address at the State Education Conference about creating inclusive classroom environments for students from diverse family structures. Her own experience had taught her that children from single-parent homes, blended families, or households headed by grandparents often felt marginalized by curriculum and activities that assumed traditional nuclear family arrangements. As she adjusted her jacket and gathered her presentation materials, Catherine felt a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. Public speaking had never come naturally to her, but she had learned that passion for her subject matter could overcome anxiety about performance. The teachers in her audience would leave with practical strategies for making all students feel valued, regardless of their family circumstances, a gift she wished she could give to her younger self, who had once believed that childlessness disqualified her from understanding children's needs. Robert appeared in the doorway, carrying a travel mug of coffee and wearing the expression of quiet pride that had become one of Catherine's favorite sights. "Ready to change some minds about what makes a family complete?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Catherine replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Though I still can't quite believe they want to hear from someone who doesn't have children of her own." "That's exactly why they need to hear from you," Robert said, kissing her forehead gently. "You understand something about nurturing and education that goes beyond biological relationships. Your students' test scores and college acceptance rates speak to that understanding better than any traditional credentials could." Indeed, Catherine's reputation as an educator had continued to grow throughout her marriage to Robert. Her innovative approaches to literature instruction had been adopted by schools throughout the district, and several of her former students had returned to thank her for inspiring their pursuit of advanced education. The literacy program she had developed now served as a model for similar initiatives in neighboring communities. The drive to the conference venue gave Catherine time to reflect on the unexpected directions her life had taken. 5 years earlier, she had been a broken woman living in a cramped apartment, convinced that her worth was tied to her ability to conceive children. Now she was recognized as a leader in educational innovation and community development, married to a man who cherished her exactly as she was, and surrounded by friends who valued her contributions rather than pitying her circumstances. The transformation hadn't been magical or instant. It had required years of difficult work, therapy to process her grief and rebuild her self-worth, deliberate choices to pursue growth rather than retreat into bitterness, and the courage to remain open to possibilities she had never imagined. But the result was a life richer and more meaningful than anything she had originally planned. As Catherine pulled into the conference center parking lot and saw the banner announcing her keynote presentation, she whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for the circuitous journey that had brought her to this moment. The Barren woman, who had once been cast out by her family, had become someone whose voice mattered, whose story inspired others, and whose legacy would live on in the countless lives she had touched through her teaching, her advocacy, and her unwavering belief that every person possessed inherent worth, regardless of their ability to fulfill society's expectations. The standing ovation that greeted her presentation that afternoon confirmed what Catherine had slowly learned to believe about herself, that her value had never been determined by what she couldn't do, but rather by who she chose to become in response to life's challenges. And in sharing that truth with others, she ensured that her story would continue to create ripples of healing and hope long after the applause had faded. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.